everyone, my name is Meera, and I'm just going to be doing the NovDec 2025 LD topic analysis for equality and forensics. I'll get into this more later, but I'm going to be going over a broad idea of the topic, but also covering what's being read on the circuit, kind of looking at past tournaments and the most common arguments. So if you feel like you already have a good background of the topic, feel free to fast forward to later sections. Before I get into like the actual analysis, I'll just kind of talk about who I am. So, like I said, my name is Meera. I've been doing LD and Parley, and this is my fourth year doing so. I'm the captain of LD at Ridge High School in New Jersey, and I've qualified to the TOC twice. So last year and this year, reached semifinals of NCFL and qualified three times and reached octofinals of Parliamentary Debate Tournament of Champions. I've also reached deep elimination rounds of a lot of national bid distributing tournaments. Okay, so with that in mind, what am I going to go over? I'm just going to be going over a background of the topic, going over common after arguments, neg arguments, and then within each, I'll cover kind of trad arguments, value criterion stuff, LARP, K's, fill, and then T/theory. And like I said before, going into what I've been seeing on the circuit. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started with the background of the topic. So let's start with definitions. So first, rewilding is defined by Oxford dictionaries as the process of restoring an area of land to its natural, uncultivated state. And I'll get a little more into what rewilding is and what it looks like a little later in the presentation, but fundamentally, you're kind of taking large tracts of land, kind of kicking people off of it, and then allowing that land to reach its natural state. A lot of times this is through reintroducing species and kind of rebuilding the quote unquote like natural ecosystem. But I'll be more specific on that a little later. Second is substantial. There are a ton of definitions of substantial out there, and I think it's going to be important in kind of T/spec debates. The most broad definition of substantial would just be like a large or like significant. So kind of those are a little wonky. I don't really know what you get out of reading those definitions, as in like what is large. Then there are a lot of definitions that define it as specific percents, i.e., 5%, 10%, 50%, right? Like you can find like half the percents out there and link into the word substantial and then be like, it's credible for this reason. And the most specific definition that I've seen is like an area of land that is capable of sustaining farmland. So, i.e., it can't be so small that it's just nothing there, but it also has to be big enough to sustain like farmland. I don't know how specific that is. I feel like you probably have to combine that with some sort of percent, but it is what I've seen. Okay, the next definition is tract of land. So tract of land is defined by Law Insider as one or more physically contiguous parcels of land owned or controlled by the same person or persons. So I think when it says the by the same person or persons, it's probably referring to the United States. So this kind of definition of tract of land could be used to specify that, like, oh, the rewilding has to occur in the United States. However, one thing that I do think is important to note is that the resolution does not say that the United States ought to like rewild substantial tracts of land in the US, right? That's not specified. So I do think that there's some leeway for like international arguments or arguments about like, oh, the US is going to go rewild in XYZ place that is not the United States. And the last thing to mention is just a broad overview is that this is a policy topic, right? You are kind of implementing action, usually through the USFG, kind of passing some sort of policy to implement rewilding in the United States. So it is going to be very policy heavy. What does implementation look like, etc., are all questions that you're going to be responsible for answering. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about what rewilding is specifically and kind of examples of it. So there are two main forms of rewilding. There's active rewilding and there's passive rewilding. Active rewilding is when you're actively reintroducing species, kind of bringing in, rebuilding this ecosystem to kind of really create what the quote unquote like natural circumstance. Passive rewilding is you kind of kick everyone off the land and then you kind of let the land do what it wants to do, right? You just leave the land alone, and the idea is that it's going to kind of be able to get to some sort of equilibrium, and that's going to be good for the environment. Most apps that I've seen on this topic have been about active rewilding, but I've definitely seen kind of passive rewilding apps and people reading tea about that. So I do think it's an important distinction. I also think that most of the solvency would come if you're actually actively rewilding, because I don't really know what the time frame looks like for passive rewilding, etc. So most ads have definitely been centered on this idea of active rewilding. The second thing to mention is that any form of rewilding necessitates unwilding, which is the idea that you are going to be kicking people off the land. Now, there are a lot of pieces of evidence out there that talks about, oh, the US has like XYZ acres of abandoned land, etc. But I think for the most part, if people are rewilding a substantial part of the United States, then you are going to have to kick off either whether it be people living in like rural areas or farmers. There is going to be some component of kind of unwilding the area, getting rid of the humans. And I think that has a lot of kind of ground for the negative as well as poses an important question for the yeah. The third thing is that a lot of rewilding means that you're introducing keystone species. So what are keystone species? They're things like bears and wolves, like these large carnivores that are kind of, or not carnivores, but yeah, these large animals that are kind of being reintroduced that have previously been like hunted out, kind of kicked off, etc. And I'll get into that a little bit later as well. A lot of rewilding, it kind of follows a lot of main components, which is that you're taking kind of a large tract of land, kind of connecting those tracts of land by creating what are known as corridors, and then bringing in these keystone species. Okay, the last thing is the most prominent example. I've seen this mostly in like a lot of my traditional debates where a lot of people will reference Yellowstone National Park because it is one of the kind of more successful forms of rewilding in the United States. Some people say that Yellowstone isn't rewilding because there is some element of human management, but I think for the most part, it's known as one of the biggest rewilding efforts. So, what is the Yellowstone Rewilding Project? Well, in the kind of early to mid 1900s, in the Yellowstone area, the wolves were kind of hunted out to extinction. Then I think in the 90s, the wolves were essentially reintroduced, i.e., people kind of actively brought in wolves. Why? Because the ecosystem in Yellowstone was not doing so great, right? There was overpopulation of elk because they had no predators, and as a result, you saw kind of there was less elk dying, which also hurts kind of scavengers like different birds. Also, kind of there was just a domino effect because, as you know, like the food chain, if you get rid of one animal, it kind of messes everything up. What happened in Yellowstone is that once they reintroduced the wolves, is that the ecosystem really got so much better, right? There's a lot of videos, I think like you might have watched this in your bio class, like the river actually switched directions. You saw beaver populations go up. You saw the elk population get into more control. You saw grazing levels become controlled. You saw more vegetation as a result. You saw scavengers being able to survive, and as a result, you saw more diversified birds, etc., etc. Yellowstone is like one of the biggest examples of successful rewilding in the United States that I think a lot of people come back to, and I think it's worth kind of definitely worth researching. But let's talk about like some projects for rewilding in the United States, right? What are we looking at in terms of rewilding? Are there ongoing projects, etc.? So the first is that there are a lot of indigenous-led projects or indigenous kind of advocacy for rewilding. Why? Well, with the onset of colonialism and kind of the eradication of kind of an extermination of indigenous people from their land, you also saw the eradication of bison. And there's a lot of kind of colonial kind of literature that talks about how i.e., like settlers came in and they would kill kind of bison slash buffalo as a like in parallel with the killing of indigenous people. And there are a lot of parallels between the two. Kind of obviously, buffalo have been really important to indigenous societies. So, what's going on right now is that you see a lot of indigenous advocacy for indigenous-led rewilding projects across the United States. There are several examples of when this worked. I think first is in Wisconsin. There was a place where we were able to reintroduce bison and create kind of it was an indigenous-led project. But second is the Rosebud Sioux tribe in South Dakota was able to also bring in, I believe it was both elk and, or sorry, I think this one was just bison, and they were able to kind of bring it in and it successfully worked. So I think those are important to reference, not only for the affirmative, because I think this is I think, yeah, mainly for the affirmative because I think this could be a really good AF and you've already been seeing it read on the circuit. The second thing is the Western Rewilding Project. So the Western Rewilding Project is actually what I've seen a lot of both traditional and LARP AFs be built off of. It's the idea that, so a bunch of scholars, I think at, like Cambridge came together and they found like 11 public tracts of land in the United States, 11 federally owned public tracts of land in the United States. And the idea is that we would kind of take those federal public lands and rewild them. And it's just to go in kind of parallel with Biden's kind of goals previously to kind of preserve land, like 30% of the United States. Essentially, it's just kind of a well-known kind of project within the literature, and I think a lot of articles refer back to the Western Rewilding Project as a model for how we could rewild in the United States. The next example is the American Prairie Project. This hasn't fully been implemented. It's more so they're trying to raise money, and there's been a lot of advocacy around it. And it's the idea of kind of rewilding the Midwest area, and bringing in a lot of keystone species there to help kind of recover a lot of the degraded lands due to things like farming, the hunting of animals, right? The ecosystem there is really out of balance, and this would essentially bring it back. And then lastly, international examples. There's a lot of examples from the UK. There's examples in South Africa and Chile, all of which where kind of rewilding has been implemented. I do think there's a lot of like back and forth about the UK example, whether it was successful or not. There were kind of, it led to harmful, I think it like kicked out a lot of small farmers in the UK, which again, I'll get into that on the disside sides of this, but those are kind of good models and examples to look into. Also, looking at meta studies that kind of look at these countries and whether it was successful can be really helpful for the. Okay, yeah, so those are just kind of the current and planned projects. So let's just move on to the AF. What are the AF arguments on this topic? Okay, the biggest argument on this topic is going to be climate, right? When you think rewilding, what is it being done for? It's to help stop climate change. But there are a lot of internal links to climate, so I just wanted to break that down before I got into like the trout arguments versus the LARP arguments, because I think regardless of what kind of debater you are, where you debate, you are going to see climate on this topic, and it's important to know all the different kind of internal links to it. So the first internal link is going to be biodiversity. So rewilding necessitates bringing in a lot of keystone species, and as a result, you're able to boost biodiversity, help bring back animals from either kind of a very endangered positions, and help kind of replenish our biodiversity. But in addition to that, when you kind of bring in these animals, you help entire ecosystems, right? Like I mentioned with the Yellowstone example, you saw increased like beaver and bird populations. You also saw kind of more trees and plants. So there's a lot of elements to biodiversity, not just animals, but also biodiversity in terms of vegetation. And lastly, I'd say biodiversity in terms of pollinators, right? In the United States, you're seeing like a huge crisis where a lot of pollinators like bees are dying out, and there's the idea that, oh, we could boost biodiversity in terms of bees. So essentially, boosting biodiversity. Biodiversity, really important for the climate, obviously, also has alternate impacts like helping with disease prevention. Having good biodiversity is good to prevent diseases, but also it can be good for kind of agriculture, right? Bringing in more pollinators. Okay, the second is carbon sequestration, right? When you kind of bring these ecosystems back, and I think the internal link here is probably biodiversity, right? Carbon sequestration is contingent on being able to have like a larger variety of like tree species, for example, or kind of more balanced ecosystems. And the idea is that these ecosystems and kind of more specifically boosting vegetation levels will help create carbon sinks in the United States, which can help reduce, kind of take basically sequester carbon. So you're kind of taking emissions from the air, and it's a carbon sink. So you would lower the overall CO2 in the atmosphere in doing so. The next internal link is water, in a couple of ways. So first and primarily is the kind of droughts example, which is that, a lot of places we're seeing huge droughts. I think especially like with the Colorado River, you're seeing like rivers drying up. You're seeing, yeah, droughts in general. The idea is that when you create more balanced ecosystems and you're able to kind of help bring in more vegetation, you're able to actually combat droughts. Now, I know my explanation of the internal link isn't the best. I haven't like read the water argument fully or like understood completely how are we going to like restructure our rivers, but I do know that when you kind of boost ecosystems and you bring in biodiversity, it does help like everything around it, including things like rivers. The next kind of internal link is going to be wildfires. So a lot of times you see I have like thoughts on the wildfires argument because I think a lot of wildfires are human led, but there are arguments that like when you have these like these unrewilded places, like these normal places in the United States, you're seeing increased rates of wildfires due to kind of unbalanced grazing levels, and as a result there's like too much vegetation. It's like messing it up and causing wildfires. Now obviously wildfires in themselves are bad, but also wildfires release a ton of CO2 into the environment, so the idea is that the app is able to combat these wildfires through rewilding. Next one is soil erosion. I think this is similar to the water argument in the sense that, when you have well, first of all, like a lot of these lands in the United States are, kind of being destroyed by farming, right? Human land management is really bad, and we've kind of destroyed a lot of ecosystems through farming. The idea is that when you kind of help rebuild these ecosystems and make it better, you help with things like soil levels, which can help with overall maintaining a better ecosystem and environment. And then the last thing I think is natural disasters. So, natural disasters is not just an impact to kind of carbon sequestration or biodiversity or really any climate impact, um, but also in itself, I think when you have really unbalanced ecosystems, you see larger rates of natural disasters. You see things like floods, etc. It's just like when you put things out of balance in the climate, you're more likely to see natural disasters, and kind of rewilding is able to fix that. Okay, yeah. So, anyways, I know I wasn't too in depth into these internal links, but I think these 6 points are, well, like very, very worthy of being researched by any debater on this topic, knowing them, understanding the internals so that you're able to kind of go for these arguments. Okay, so let's talk about trad debate specifically. So I think for your value, it's probably going to be ought because ought implies morality. In terms of the value criterion, I think most of what I'm seeing is just util or structural violence or kind of fancy ways of phrasing util or structural violence. I'm of the opinion that a lot of frameworks that people read um, tend to collapse to util or structural violence. So you see like ecological justice, right? It like comes down to like, oh, kind of protecting the environment and stopping climate change, which is just util. So at the end of the day, most things are just collapsing to util or structural violence. I think I've also seen like a traditional form of Kant property rights being read, but that's definitely more of a neg argument, though I'll get to into the fill section, there are plenty of reasons for why Kant affirms on this topic, and I think you could obviously read Kant on your traditional circuit. In terms of what I've seen with trad, first is that a lot of trad apps have kind of referenced the Western Rewilding Network, right? You don't, as a on a lot of circuits, you don't need to provide a plan, right? You don't need to say like, oh, we're going to implement this. But I do think it can be helpful to be like, hey, we're modeling it off of this plan, just to like be like, yeah, we know what we're doing. Like the app is very clear. So a lot of apps I've seen have been modeled off the Western Rewilding Network. In terms of how much land are they rewilding, I've seen a lot of like 5 to 10% of land in the United States. Not really fully sure how people came to that conclusion besides like arbitrary definitions, because I think the Western Rewilding Network is more than 5 to 10% of land, but those are just definitely things I've seen. So I think in terms of arguments, I've seen a lot of people going for climate as like a sole contention. I think that's a pretty good strategy, right? You could do like subpoint A biodiversity, subpoint B like wildfire, subpoint C like carbon sequestration, and I think that would be a very strong affirmative that you could read on this topic. The second thing is the economy with ecotourism. For example, like national parks like Yellowstone actually do make a substantial amount of money, and the idea is that you can kind of bring humans in and kind of look at the wildlife, and as a result, we can generate federal revenue. The reason I think that gets a little tricky is that obviously rewilding is kind of getting rid of human management. So it's like, to what extent can you still allow ecotourism in a place that is rewilded? But I do think it's worth looking into because I think that Yellowstone is probably a pretty good example of this. The next is Indigenous justice. I do think that like most contentions about Indigenous people flow probably neg on this topic, but I think people are reading apps about how we're able to bring justice to Indigenous people, whether it be by rewilding bison or kind of working with Indigenous people to implement rewilding. Now, I think that gets a little pushing into like how topical that is, considering the actor is the United States, but I think it's still something I've definitely seen people reading. And the last contention I've seen people reading is like horses. So the idea is that like a lot of places like herd management areas, like horses are kind of horribly abused, and it's kind of, yeah, there's just horses are horribly abused, and kind of rewilding would help fix that and help kind of make it so that horses are not being like managed by humans, but rather get free reign and are able to live, reducing abuse. I think you can also link that to kind of stopping climate change for a multitude of reasons. So let's get into LARP. So first, I think a full res app on this topic, like I think there's a lot of like, oh, you shouldn't read full res, like read a subset. But like I think the full res app on this topic is pretty good, right? You can kind of use the Western Rewilding Network and be like, hey, we're rewilding this and we're just affirming the entire resolution, which I think would be great. And I think it's a very strategic app that you can go for climate on. I think the main debate on climate is going to be like a spillover debate, right? To what extent are you actually able to stop climate change, considering, the state that the United States is in terms of renewable energy, the amount of fossil fuels we're allowing, especially under the Trump administration. Like, how much of an internal to climate are you going to win? I think that this can be combated by finding very specific scenarios, i.e., like this specific river, or we need to kind of fix this, and that will help balance this and save XYZ amount of people, or bringing in this amount of biodiversity will help mitigate the effects to some extent, which can still solve like some level of extinction. So I think you're going to have a very good internal link and really research like how are you actually going to solve climate change. The next thing is that I think, like we talked about before, we can kind of go into food or water wars as just like impacts to an app. I think independently, climate change links to food and water wars because you're seeing like the decline of pollinators, which can hurt agriculture and lead to food wars. You're also seeing droughts, which I've talked about before, and that can lead to water wars. But I think you can also talk about maybe like specific rivers that are kind of there. You're seeing like conflict over. I've seen scenarios about kind of restoring a specific river will help kind of alleviate tensions between the US and XYZ country. I think you definitely have to do more research into that. Again, it's like a more shaky internal link, but I think it's definitely worth reading. Okay, so what about spec AF? So there's trophic rewilding. Trophic rewilding isn't really spec AF. I feel like it's just the resolution. It's the idea of like you're bringing in keystone species and rewilding through that, which I think is probably definitionally what rewilding is, but I think it can be worthy to specify that. The second is HMAs or herd management areas. So that's like the horses app I was talking about before. The next thing I've seen is like an Arctic permafrost app, which is that we're going to kind of rewild the Arctic permafrost because obviously you're seeing the melting of permafrost and that can release things like diseases. It's also really bad for the climate, and kind of focusing on that will be beneficial to stop climate change. Next is the Great Plains app, which is just an extension of what I was talking about with the prairie stuff, which is that we kind of focus on rewilding the Midwest and kind of bringing back things like bison, for example, to help rebalance ecosystems and combat the degradation of land due to human land management. The next thing is urban land, so focusing on cities. I think it's important to remember that rewilding, if you, okay, like for example, if you've ever been to New York City, there are kind of areas like the near the edge and like there's the High Line where they've kind of reintroduced biodiversity and tried to reintroduce some native plants. I don't think that counts as rewilding because you aren't really reducing human land management. It is very, very much land like that is managed by humans, and kind of you're kind of integrating more plants and native vegetation into the city. Whereas I think rewilding would necessitate really destroying the city. So I think but I think you can read an urban lands app where it's just like, okay, we're gonna take like a part of cities and rewild those, because obviously cities are really, really bad for climate change, not just because of the buildings themselves, the like the use of land is bad. The kind of you see amounts of like cars, transportation, etc. Like cities are just bad for the climate, and kind of rewilding part of that can help solve climate change. I mean, I think that's also the place where the most amount of people live, so there's a lot of questions there, but I think it's worth the researching. And then last is like a fracking app, which is like, how are you going to solve rewilding? Well, you could kind of, or how would you do rewilding? It could be like by taking land, like you would specifically rewild on lands that are currently being used for fracking, and as a result, you could kind of resolve some climate change because obviously fracking is really, really bad for the environment. Okay, let's talk about soft left apps. There are a couple soft left apps I think are viable on this topic. First is like a cap app. I haven't actually seen this being read so far, but I do think that it could work, right? The idea that kind of taking land away and kind of reducing cities and not just like using every piece of land for the most amount of profit, but rather really allowing the land to go back to its natural state can be a form of combating capitalism and can be a form of dismantling kind of our like systems that are constantly focused on profit above all else. Because I think obviously rewilding probably isn't profitable, and it's more so about like people over profit. The second is indigenous-led projects. Like I was mentioning before, a lot of indigenous groups have been kind of focusing on finding ways to rewild land and kind of lead projects. Again, I think this like leads to the question of like who is doing the app? Is it the USFG? In which case, like what solvency do you have? Is it indigenous people? In which case, are you really topical? But I do think that it is a valuable app. The next is like reinterpretations of the topic or rewilding. I think that there's probably a lot of like literature in like literature about what it means for something to be wild or what it means for things to be rewilded. And I think you can by going into a lot of like maybe like post-colonialist literature, etc., and kind of really researching like what does the concept of wild actually mean, and kind of finding maybe a way to reinterpret the topic as like rewilding being decolonization. Um, I've also seen like a linguistics app that is about like rewilding to kind of like change our conceptions of like Western thinking. So I think there's a lot of like different forms of like when the term rewilding has been used. I think you could also do something like, Turtle Island with rewild as a form of kind of combining my this like indigenous led project idea. And then the last would be like anthropocentrism or however you pronounce that, the idea of that like putting animals, you should put like animals over people. I honestly haven't read any like anthrolit or looked into it, so I'm not the expert on this, but I do think that if you are someone who likes reading anthropocentrism, this is probably the topic to do that on. Okay, let's move on to Phil, which is, we'll just say it's not my forte by any means. I've never read Phil, so I think if you're interested in reading Phil, feel free to reach out or just, I think you probably have to do research, but this is my general understanding of Phil and what I've seen based on like wiki stalking. So first on Kant, I think Kant affirms for a lot of reasons. First is the idea that by using land and taking up land, that is not universalizable because you are kind of actively taking away land that other people could be using. Um, and you're also leaving less of it for future generations by kind of using up or kind of taking up the resources from that land. I think that you could probably link that back to Kant. Second is like environmental destruction is probably pretty bad under Kant, kind of destroying lands for human use to be able to prioritize all that stuff. Kind of combining it with the idea of taking up resources is bad. I've also seen people kind of just reading arguments that like under Kant we have a duty to protect animals, which obviously would go very intuitively with rewilding. The next thing is intuitions, which is that like we cannot like intuit to disrupt nature, or we cannot have an intuition to kind of destroy or take up resources from nature, which means that kind of rewild only rewilding makes sense under intuitions. And then under Locke, I think the idea of again taking up resources that especially you're taking up those resources and then because those resources are finite, future generations cannot use them, which I think is bad under the Lockean proviso. Again, I would very much recommend reading these apps and understanding the literature before you go straight into cutting film. Okay, so that's what I have for the affirmative. Big kind of the summary is going to be climate. Yeah, lots of climate. Also lots of areas for specification, whether you are kind of rewilding a certain part of the United States. It's the Great Prairies, it's the Western Rewilding Network, or you want to do a specific type of rewilding where you're kicking out frackers. Like there is a lot of room for a lot of variety of apps on this topic, but I do think that almost every app is going to have a climate change advantage. Okay, let's talk about the neg. Okay, so let's talk about trad debate on the neg. Again, I think in the traditional debates I've had on this topic and the traditional debates that I've judged on this topic, the value criterion clash has not really come up that much. Like a lot of people apps have just read util and the neg has been like, great, let's use util, and then it becomes like a climate versus econ debate, i.e. climate change versus agriculture on the neg. So I don't think you would actually need to, if you want to just have a policy debate, I think you could just have a util debate and not really engage in like a value criterion debate. But I do think that there are a lot of structural violence arguments, i.e., who are we taking the land from? Are we taking the land from indigenous people? A lot of environmental projects in the past have been like, oh, great, let's make everything like really friendly and kind of help the United States be the better actor, and then kicked indigenous people off their land. So, I mean, there's a lot of structural room for like structural violence arguments, and I think it's important to talk about on this topic. So I do think you could have the structural violence argument. I've also seen LeConte property rights, as I'll get into on Phil, is going to be really big on this topic, so I think you could read Kant as well. Okay, in terms of arguments that I've been seeing. Okay, the first argument is just agriculture, right? This idea that if we're rewilding a substantial part of the United States, we are probably kicking farmers off their land, or to some extent. And as a result, 90% of farmers in the United States are small family farms. So they can't afford to just be like, oh, yeah, we're just going to rebuild somewhere else, or we'll be fine, right? It's going to have a substantial effect on our agriculture, kind of our agriculture side of the United States. And that's really bad for a lot of reasons. First, like agriculture makes up a huge percent of our, I mean, not a huge, I think it's like 3 to 5% of our GDP. So obviously that would probably push us into a recession and be really bad. But second, I think you can look into like food wars impacts. Not sure how that great that is for like traditional debate. I think the better impact is probably just like hurts the economy. But yeah, definitely the biggest argument I've seen on this topic. Next is offshoring, which is the idea that, let's say, I think this is probably like an either or scenario. Like either you are agriculture or you offshore and you don't have any solvency. So either you're kicking like small farmers off their land, and as a result, we just don't have an agriculture industry, or you're kicking like some corporations off, or you're kicking kind of yeah, corporations, commercial farming, etc. You're kicking these people off their land. In which case, they're gonna go to other countries and yeah, they're gonna go to other countries and just continue their work there. And the reason this is really bad is because they might go to countries like Brazil or Africa, where, yeah, countries like Brazil, continents like Africa, and there's less environmental regulation there. Those places are a lot more biodiverse than the United States, which means at the end of the day, you actually have a worse climate impact, and you end up harming the climate more than you help it. I think there's a really good example of this by like the UK Center of Ecology did a study on how it would like create 5 times more harms than it would benefits when it comes to the climate when looking in like terms of offshoring. So I think that's a great argument to read on this topic. The next I've seen is like invasive species. And honestly, I've judged this argument a lot and I don't get it. Like I've judged and debated it and I literally don't understand the argument because I think the our premise of the argument is that you're when you rewild and you bring kind of animals into land, you might also bring in invasive species. I think in two regards. I've seen this explained in two ways. The first explanation is that, well, it's been so many years, like the ecosystems have just fundamentally changed. So if you try to like bring back animals that like were once there but aren't there anymore, you're just gonna like mess everything up. But the second thing is that like when you're literally bringing the animals over, right, we would have to like there's some conception of like, oh, we're gonna breed animals for rewilding and then bring those animals in. Then it's like, oh, invasive species might somehow like come onto these like buses and or ships that are transporting animals and then like get into these ecosystems and then destroy the climate. So I've seen it explained in those both ways. I think at the end of the day, the idea is that rewilding would entail some form of invasive species coming in, which would destroy the climate. Okay, and the last argument I've been seeing is indigenous rights, which is the argument that in rewilding, we are going to be taking land away from indigenous people, which obviously is really, really bad, and we wouldn't want that for a litany of reasons. Okay, so let's talk about LARP, LARP on the neck. So I think in terms of disads, you're seeing a lot of agriculture with impacts like food wars and econ. I think that's just the biggest thing I've seen across everyone. Second is politics. Like, what is Trump's reaction to rewilding going to be? I think like last week this was probably a much bigger question when it came to the shutdown. Like, shutdown is going to pass now, but rewilding would push us over the edge. But obviously that's like over. So I think there's a lot of other impacts. You can look into politics though. So you can look into what would Trump do? Would he kind of rescind other climate funding? Where would we get this funding from? Is he going to be like mad? Are we going to lead to layoffs? Is it going to lead to a huge like disaster in Congress, right? Like the US political system is like fucked up. So maybe this will mess it up even more. I think there's a lot of stuff you can read there. Okay, the next is like econ plus bizcon. I think this is an impact of agriculture, but also like in itself, rewilding would probably be pretty expensive, right? You have to kick people off their land. According to the Fifth Amendment, you have to give just compensation. So you would also have to pay the people that you're kicking off their land. And then you would, is there going to be some sort of like breeding of animals? Okay, well, we have to bring in scientists. Like how much, there are a lot of costs, and I think you can kind of find analysis of how much it would be in total. And that would really be bad for the economy, but also lower things like business confidence because you're harming the economy. Okay. What about counterplans? I think you see a lot of like your standard types of counterplans, right? Advantage counterplans, process, consult, like picks, like all of those very viable and very intuitive, I think. Like advantage counterplans, other ways of formally kind of solving the app, but there are other forms of solving climate change. Like, should we invest more in renewable energy because rewilding is bad? Process counterplans, you always have sunsets, you always have concurrent resolutions, right? So those are things you see on every topic because the same cards are just reused. But let's go into more specifics. So in terms of advantage counterplans, the first thing, if there's like some sort of advantage about preventing war with another country, maybe whether it be through like reducing tensions or in food wars, you could kind of read an alternate way of solving this, i.e. providing military aid to some other place. I think this is really contingent on what AF you hit. I've seen this being read against asks that are like international too, like we should rewild in like the Baltic, for example, and the impact scenario there is like, oh, we should instead give military aid, stuff like that. Okay, the second thing is like incentivizing private sector spending. So obviously The net benefit to this would be avoiding the econ disad. The idea is that instead of the federal government using money, you would provide things like tax credits to private companies or be like, hey, we support this, and try to find ways to incentivize private companies into fundraising and spending on rewilding instead of the government in order to help our economy. The next thing is providing subsidies to kind of different companies. I think subsidies is a little tricky because obviously it would be a big cost on the government, but also the government isn't the one doing it now. So definitely a debate to be had there. Last, I've seen rewild oceans rather than rewilding land. I think I've seen actually like different definition of what land entails, i.e., is land just like physical land or does land include bodies of water? Um, I know it sounds like counterintuitive, but I've definitely seen definitions that argue it is. But the idea is that instead of rewilding the land and, kicking farmers off, let's rewild oceans because we wouldn't kick anyone off, which means we maintain the economy, but also, the ocean is one of our biggest carbon sinks, and we can really solve climate change by rewilding oceans. Okay. Next thing is process counterplans. So the idea of a continued resolution, which is that, for example, we might put pressure, continued resolutions. The next is reciprocal commitments. So the idea that, for example, we would only do rewilding if the EU also agrees to do rewilding, and you would have evidence that says like EU says yes, and then that's much better because now both the AF and the EU are doing like are rewilding and it just compete off of the AF must only defend resolution type stuff. Um and compete off of probably things like immediacy as well. The next thing is like impeachment, which is that like, oh, the US, like I thought this was a fun counterplan, which is like, oh, we should like impeach like if the president does not pass rewilding, then we would impeach them, and then it would be like Trump doesn't pass it, so then we would impeach Trump, which solves a lot of issues in the United States, and then Vance would do it, and it's better, and it solves climate. I think there's like a pretty long link chain there, but I think it's definitely a counterplan I've been seeing reading, been seen being read. There we go. Okay. Consult counterplans. So many actors you could consult. I think first is like an Indigenous people consult counterplan. Does this have the potential of being kind of colonialist because you're like, hey, Indigenous people, what should we do? And then like not letting Indigenous people lead the project. Yeah, but I think I've seen it being read. The second, I've seen like a consult Netanyahu counterplan in order to kind of create more stable systems and agreements with um, Israel, which, questionable, but whatever. Like I'm just listing arguments that I've seen read on the circuit. So yeah, those are the main ones. I think you definitely want to look around for what disads you see, what counterplans. There's a lot. Okay, let's talk about case. I think this is a really good topic for if you like reading case, primarily for set call, which is what I've seen kind of almost everyone reading. Lots of links to set call. First is the idea of, taking land, right? Are we kicking indigenous people off when we take this land to quote unquote like rewild? Second is the conception of what does it mean to be wild, right? I think when we think about rewilding, it's like, okay, we want to take the land back to how it was pre-European colonization, which is like okay, so like who is interpreting what wild means? Like this is a really colonial idea of like, okay, with like indigenous people living on the land, and kind of having indigenous people living on the land, is that considered wild? Like what is this idea? Like I think that a use of the word wild is problematic in a lot of ways. Second is that like settlers are going to be interpreting what they think wild means, and that is obviously going to be colonialist and ideas of like who deserves to live somewhere if you're like looking at it in a wild sense, right? I think, yeah, there's a lot to read on the word wild. It's really problematic for a lot of reasons. Um, then is the idea of like subsuming indigenous perspectives, i.e., settlers are coming in and being like, okay, let's solve the environment by kind of repairing our relationship to land. And, settlers have a really messed up conception of like this is going to be like very ignorant of indigenous perspectives in regards to relationship with land and what rewilding should look like, which I think could be somewhat a link of omission, but I think there's definitely a lot of literature that will talk about why rewilding in itself ignores and kind of harms indigenous people. So I think set call is definitely a big thing on this topic. The next thing is like the cap K. I haven't been seeing it read, but I think in general the cap K is like losing prominence on the circuit. But I think the way you could kind of look at the cap K is in terms of like green capitalism. So green capitalism is the concept that like we keep capitalism and we keep trying to make capitalism green, right? So that we can reinscribe capitalism, being like, hey, we can solve climate change and still be capitalist. But a lot of Marxist literature will kind of, or just capitalist literature will talk about how green capitalism is a contradiction, but B, never going to solve climate change because capitalism in itself is inherently bad for the climate and will always put kind of profit over people. And, we'll do one climate thing, but it's just a guise to be like, oh, we're going to expand fossil fuels somewhere else. So I think that there's a lot to talk about in terms of cap, but I haven't seen it really read on this topic so far. Okay, Phil. I wrote Skep, yeah, because all I see is Skep. I feel like so many people just read Skep now, which is cool. I like Skep. I feel like it's a cool argument, but yeah, I feel like the majority of people are like reading Kant on the F and then they're like reading Skep and a bunch of shells on the egg. So I don't know. I think it's important to look at. But I think there's arguments for why Kant negates, specifically due to property rights, right? Fifth Amendment says like you would probably be kicked, or kind of the fact that we just don't have this land means that you're kind of kicking people off of their land, which the argument is that no, they have like a right to that land, right? They've like lived there, right? And I think property rights is really important under Kant, so you can definitely read that as a neg argument. Okay, tea and theory, I think is going to be really fun on this topic. I think you're going to see a lot of spec debates, a lot of tea debates, which they're fun. Okay, so let's talk about spec. Many things. First, like spec, what substantial is spec, what model you're forming, like spec, how you're rewilding. Is it like what form of rewilding? Is it active, passive? Are you bringing in like is it trophic rewilding where you're bringing in keystone species? Like what is the AF actually doing? Because I think the definition of rewilding is probably pretty vague, and the definition of substantial is also pretty vague. So I think the app definitely needs to specify these things, and otherwise you're going to hit spec shells about like you not specifying that. Because I do think it's important to know. The second is subsets, right? We see this on every topic. Like you are only rewilding. Like, okay, I think this is. I think subsets is weird on this topic because you are not rewilding the entire United States, right? The topic does not say that you're doing that in any sense, but it's like you are only rewilding one specific section, which isn't substantial. So I think this like it's not subsets. It's really just going to be T substantial, like rather than like oh like you can't say herd management areas. Like why not? That's substantial, right? So I think it like comes into T substantial rather than your traditional T subsets arguments. Okay, the next ones are going to be T rewilding. So, what is your definition of rewilding? I think most apps are going to be like, okay, it should be like active rewilding. But if someone says like passive rewilding, where you just let the land do its thing, like I think a lot of people will be like, yo, like that's not the definition of rewilding. Like rewilding necessitates bringing in these keystone species. Rewilding necessitates actively trying to kind of rebuild these ecosystems. So a lot of debates about what should rewilding look like and what does it mean. The next is going to be T International. I meant to mention this more on the AF page, but I think that there are definitely, and I've seen AFs that do not rewild in the United States, right? The AF does not, like, the resolution does not say you must rewild in the United States. But, so that means people might be like, oh, I'm going to rewild Arctic permafrost, or I'm going to rewild in, I think there's like the Baltic states one. There's, yeah, where people are rewilding there. But I definitely think that those apps are going to hit some sort of T international, especially if you remember the definitions we went over at the start of this lecture, which is that kind of substantial tracts of land have to be owned by the same person. Not the best definition, but yeah, I think people can make the argument that it has to be within the United States. I also think that independently, there's just, I don't know, like if someone reads an app that is about a different country, I think there's a lot of just like implementation questions to be had there. So that could be a shell, or you could read that as like a dis add-on case. Anyways, I digress or whatever. Okay, and then last is T substantial. Kind of already talked about that before. What does it mean to be substantial? Are you substantial enough? Or is this like random place that you've decided to reweld really just too small for us to get any leverage to decide? So I think T substantial is going to be big on this topic as well. Okay, so that's all I have for this topic analysis. I hope it was helpful and that you have an idea of what the topic looks like and what the different arguments are going to look like. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out through the Equality and Forensics Discord. If you aren't already, make sure you join the IF Discord. There are so many resources, availability of like, we have like scrimmages every other week. It's a great place to get practice for debate and get access to resources. So I would highly recommend either joining or volunteering your time to help out with the organization.